Hi folks, Dave, the Honest Audiophile. Benchmark, reference, music, and gear. Does it really matter? These are my Honest Audiophile thoughts and opinions. A question I often get asked is, what gear and music do I use to review and compare products? In most reviews, I mention what gear I used to do the review, and also I'll mention what gear I used to do the comparison. But I don't always mention what is my benchmark reference gear. I don't normally mention music tracks at all in my videos, but I always include down in the description a link to a song list. Music is all around us, and there are so many artists, songs, genres of music to choose from. It seems like the options are endless. Everyone listens to different music. We all have preferences in artists and songs and genres. And there's nothing wrong with liking one artist over another, or liking one song over another, or liking a certain genre of music better than another. But does that impact your sound impressions of gear? There's so much gear to choose from, different manufacturers, different sound signatures, different types of technologies, and it can be hard to know the differences, let alone hear the differences. So how do you know which one is best for you? Which one to pick over the other, and why select one or a few as your reference gear, and what songs do you use? Are there certain genres of music or certain songs that reveal more about gear than others? Yes. Music preference does impact gear impressions. Orchestral, jazz, and acoustical genres are the best recordings for presenting a natural and realistic reproduction of instruments and vocalists. Every piece of gear that I review goes through an extensive listening and scrutinizing period. I have several playlists that I use during that time with various genres, artists, and songs. In every video description, there's a list of 21 songs that I use to do my review with. These songs are the final exam of all the gear that I review. Each DAC, each amplifier, each headphone, each IEM, each speaker, each DAP are intensely listened to, scrutinized, and compared to my benchmark gear with those 21 songs. Those 21 songs are my benchmark, and they are the final and defining listening session as to whether the gear under scrutiny is worthy of a recommendation or not. Do keep in mind that I listened to a lot more songs prior to that final exam, and a lot of impressions are already set, but the final exam confirms all of it. There are so many variables that come into play when we scrutinize gear, but the most important are quality recordings and a neutral, natural, accurate source. So what's my reference music, and why do I use those 21 songs? Let's take a look at each one of those songs on my reference list individually, and I'll give you some more reasons in a more in-depth look as to why I chose them and use them as my benchmark. Beat by the Tingvall Trio. I'm listening for a natural piano tone and timbre, percussion tone and timbre, bass tone and timbre. This track has fantastic piano tonality. You can clearly hear the piano tones with its sharp edges and its bite to it. There's a fantastic timbre about it. You can clearly follow the piano through the track without it getting lost behind the other instruments. If the piano gets swallowed up or sounds recessed and behind in the mix, then your gear has a recessed mid-range. If the piano is thin and lean sounding, then your gear lacks note weight and density. We've Just Begun by Sinne. I'm listening for accurate stage depth, layering, and imaging, and female vocalist tone and timbre. This track is an example of multiple layers in a soundstage and has exceptional imaging. There are instruments all over the stage, but you can easily place each one of them if the gear has quality skills in imaging. If the gear lacks imaging, this song will sound very boring, and it will have a 3-blob effect, and the various instruments will meld together and will sound very similar. Molly Johnson's What a Little Moonlight Can Do. I'm listening for a female vocalist tone timbre, piano tone timbre, and an accurate stage depth and layering. Molly Johnson has a very unique and beautiful voice, and this track is a splendid example of a female vocal tone. She has tremendous control of her breathing and voice inflections, and on quality gear you can subtly hear all of them. On gear that struggles with tone and timbre, this song sounds very off-putting, and it will sound very boring and flat. Also, instruments will overpower Molly's vocals and gear that is too V-shaped. Under Pressure by Leslie Odom Jr. I'm listening for male vocalist tone and timbre, detail retrieval, resolution, and control. Leslie Odom Jr. has a very distinctive male voice that is front and center in this track. Leslie has a controlled breathing and vocal inflections in the song that are clearly heard on quality gear. If gear struggles with tone and timbre, this song will sound very flat and lifeless. V-shaped signatures will overpower this track in the bass and in the treble, and Leslie's vocals will sound very distant on the stage. Change the World by Eric Clapton. I'm listening for a male vocalist tone and timbre, imaging, layering, and placement. This track has a lot going on, and it is a great reference for many reasons, but I focus on the soundstage, the layering, and the placement aspects. The stage is very well defined, and the placement of the instruments and Eric Clapton is clear as day. Layering is phenomenal, and there is no melding or overlapping. Nothing is competing for attention. All instruments are audible and easy to follow. If the gear struggles with staging, depth, layering, and placement, this track's going to sound very cramped and smushed. Ecstasy of Gold by Yo-Yo Ma. I'm listening for natural tone and timbre. This is one of the most famous movie themes of all time. This track is an accurate reproduction of tone and timbre. Clearly defined timbre of instruments and accurate tone of the orchestra is full on display. If the gear sounds metallic or plasticky or rubbery, then this gear struggles with tone and timbre. Spem and Alium by Adam Baldych. Listening for natural tone and timbre, accurate note weight and density, and percussive impact. This track is an accurate reproduction of tone and timbre. All instruments portrayed are exceptionally reproduced with accuracy. Note weight and density are very lifelike and true. If this track sounds thin, lean, or off-putting, or has a very thick and bass prominent, then the gear struggles with tone and timbre, note weight, and density. Stress by Pain of Salvation. In this track, I'm listening for bass extension, natural tone and timbre, control, and percussion balance and cohesion. This track has fantastic bass and percussion balance. This is a very well-defined bass line within the track. This track portrays a balanced approach while being expressive under control. With a V-shaped signature, this track will be very bass prominent and overly expressive in the upper mids and lower treble. Gear that struggles with resolution and definition will smear this track, and it will have a one-note percussion strikes and a very ill-defined bass. When I Fall in Love by Michael Buble. I'm listening for a male vocal tone and timbre, dynamics throughout the entire frequency response, soundstage depth, and layering. With this track, dynamic range is on full display. There are rises and dips throughout the track along with fantastic stage depth and layering. If gear struggles with depth and layering, this track will sound very straight-lined in front of you. If gear struggles with dynamic range, the track will struggle with energy and emotion and will sound very lackluster. Code Cool by Patricia Barber. Listening for sibilance and hot treble. There are many opportunities for sibilance and hot treble within this track. Keep in mind, there is a bit of natural sibilance that occurs with Patricia's voice, but starting around the 1 minute 30 mark, there's a very significant amount of sibilance and hot treble in the track. This track is very painful on gear that struggles with sibilance and hot treble, but it is tolerable for gear that has accurate tone, timbre, and is elevated to natural levels in the upper mids and treble. If the gear struggles with over elevated mids and treble, you're going to have issues with tone and timbre, and it's going to be a very intolerable song. New Orleans by Christian Scott. Beware, this track is very painful on most gear. I'm listening for forward upper mids and lower treble, sharpness, harshness, lackluster detail resolution. This track is very aggressive and edgy and can be extremely fatiguing. There is excellent tone and timbre, the resolution and definition is slightly sloppy, and the potential for upper mid-range and lower treble to be shouty is very real. On gear that has upper mid-range and lower treble that is elevated to natural levels, the song will be borderline intense. On gear that is overly elevated, this song will be very intolerable and will sound like the trumpet is centimeters from your ears. Chocolate Chip Trip by Tool. For this song, I'm listening for imaging, precision, stage width, depth, and layering. This is another classic track that I use as an image test. There's so many elements floating around, shuffling, moving about the stage. It's crazy controlled chaos. Depth, layering, and width are all on display, and placement is impeccable. Good imaging gear will put you on the imaginary drummer stool, and this song brings out the best of air drummers. Gear that struggles with imaging will portray this track with a 3 blob effect, and there will be gaps as elements travel around the stage. Why So Serious by Hans Zimmer. I'm listening for sub-bass extension, bass punch, slam, and impact. This is another popular track that is a notable example of extension, especially bass extension. As the track builds in suspense, the bass extension grows. Gear that is rolled off in the bass will sound very lackluster and less imposing. Gear that lacks extension will not portray a lot of the deeper segments of the song, and it will lack detail and definition in those sections of the track. No Limit by Marcus Miller. I listen for bass tone, timbre, and control. Controlled bass is what I'm looking for on this track. The bass line is very defined, and the instruments are reproduced with accurate tone and timbre. Gear that is not elevated correctly, or is bloated, or is muddy, will struggle with this track, as the bass line will become very one-notish and thick, or it can be too thin and lean. Conference of the Birds by Dave Holland Quartet. I'm listening for natural tone and timbre, realistic stage width, depth, and layering, and detail retrieval and resolution. This track has a lot going on, and it should flow very easily and very cohesively. A different approach to controlled bass on this track, as it is more about the tone, timbre, note weight, and density. This track is exceptional for stage width, depth, layering, and imaging as well. Every element of this track is easily identified and can be followed throughout the track on quality gear. If gear struggles with tone and timbre, this track will reveal that. If gear struggles with imaging, depth, layering, and width, this track will sound very compressed and muddled. 47 Ronin by Ilhan Eshkeri. I'm listening for dynamic range, percussion impact, instrumentation, tone, timbre, realistic stage width, depth, and layering. This is a track that has an orchestra in full throat with dynamic range and overall dynamic punch and slam. This track is a perfect example of tone and timbre of an orchestra with the pedal to the metal. There is exemplary control and resolution on this track. The soundstage portrays the size of a music hall, and there's great depth and layering. Instrument separation is natural and accurate. On gear that struggles with tone and timbre, there will be a dullness and an inability to differentiate between instruments, and a bunch of melding will occur. Gear that struggles with detail retrieval and resolution will make this track sound very one note. Gear that struggles with staging, layering, and separation will cause this track to sound very compressed. 2049 by Hans Zimmer. I'm listening for sub-bass extension, sibilance, percussive impact, upper mids, lower treble, forwardness, stage width, and imaging. This track has two things that are checked: sub-bass presence and sibilance. Most noticeable is the sub-bass presence throughout, but there is upper mid-range elevations that is prone to sibilance as well. This track will sound either too thick and muddy or too thin and lean in the bass on gear that is not properly portraying sub-bass. Sibilance is part of this track, but it will be overly intense on gear that is elevated to improper levels. Believe by Cher. Now, beware, this track is very painful on most gear. In this track, I'm listening for sibilance, hot treble, and distortion. Notoriously known as a sibilance test track, and rightly so, this track is also a reference for hearing distortion. Keep in mind this track has some natural sibilance to it, but it shouldn't be annoyingly intense. Gear that struggles with detail retrieval will not portray the distortion that is in the track, most notably during the chorus. Gear that is overly elevated to unnatural levels in the upper mid-range sections will sound intensely sibilant and shouty with this track. Passenger 57 by Stanley Clarke. I'm listening for bass extension, bass control, percussive impacts, imaging, and placement. This track is a great example of imaging, separation, and placement in bass and percussion. Gear that is boosted in the bass will cause this track to sound very thick, muddy, and sluggish. Gear that struggles with detail retrieval, resolution, imaging, separation, and placement will portray this track with a very narrow and compressed stage that lacks detail. The Pine of the Appian Way by the Slovak Radio Symphony Orchestra. It's part of the Respighi Pines of Rome. I'm listening for a realistic soundstage, width, depth, and layering, instrumentation, separation, and a natural tone and timbre. This track is excellent for checking the soundstage, imaging, separation, dynamic range, as the entire orchestra is on display. As the track builds in intensity, there is a defined bass line and various sections of the instruments to check for tone and timbre, and then as the conclusion nears, the stage width and depth and the details and the resolution and definition all get tested. There's a consistent separation throughout. Imaging is spectacular as you can place all the instruments and follow them through the track, and the dynamic range from low to high and everything in between. Gear that struggles with detail retrieval will sound bland. Gear that struggles with resolution and definition will sound smeared and blurred. Gear that struggles with tone and timbre will throw off the entire tonality of the track, and gear that does not image well will cause the track to sound very muddled. And gear that struggles with stage width, depth, and layering will cause this track to sound very compressed and lifeless. You Are My Sunshine by Houston Person. I'm listening for a natural tone and timbre, realistic detail retrieval, and resolution. My personal favorite acoustical track and my go-to for tone and timbre. This track should sound like you have the bass in your hand. This track has the most accurate note weight and density and the purest reproduction of tone and timbre. If the bass doesn't sound realistic or you can't differentiate that the instrument is a bass and not a guitar, the gear struggles with tone and timbre. A couple of honorable mentions. Singing in the Rain by Diana Krall. I listen for natural tone and timbre, separation, and female vocal tone and timbre. Last of the Mohicans by 40 Fingers. I listen for natural tone and timbre, separation, and a realistic detail retrieval and resolution. And then America the Beautiful, God Bless America medley by David Phelps. I'm listening for male vocal tone and timbre, natural tone and timbre, separation, and layering. So what's my reference gear? Why do I use what I do? When I'm reviewing, I want the most accurate and true reproduction of the music as possible so that I can give the most honest impressions of the gear. The gear I use provides me the most accurate and true reproduction of music possible that I've heard within my financial means. I use Audiophile Studio as my music management program, and I have it set to play bit perfect and do not use any of the enhancements that are available. I listen at volume levels between 65 dB and 75 dB. The majority of my listening is done using downloaded music, but I do stream occasionally using Amazon HD. I use a Mytek Liberty DAC 2 as my benchmark DAC as it offers the most neutral, natural, and accurate sonics. I use the Headamp GSX Mini as my benchmark amplifier as it offers the cleanest and most accurate sonics. Headphones that I use are the Odyssey LCD5, the Allo S5X, Austrian Audio HiX 60, HiFem and Aria Stealth, the Rosin Red Zero, the Drop Sennheiser HD8XX, and the Odyssey LCD2 Closed, as they all offer the best neutral, natural, and accurate reproductions of sound. I also use the CTM DaVinci 10, ADV M512D, Zen's Mangard Top, Moondrop Kato, and the Tin Hi-Fi P1 Max as IEM benchmarks. How did I choose my reference music and gear? It all started by listening to live music. I was able to understand what instruments and vocalists sounded like by hearing things in a live setting. I then seeked out music and gear that reproduced those live experiences as close to realistic. Listening to live music on a consistent basis helped to install the baseline sonics that I was seeking in gear. Comparing reproduced music to live music consistently, slowly over time, helped me to decide what gear was the closest to reality that I could afford. As new gear comes and goes, it is compared but rarely unseats what I currently have. Should everyone have a benchmark reference? Yes, you should. Why? Why do I choose to feature the songs that I do? It's because I believe that orchestra, jazz, and acoustical genres are the best recordings for presenting a natural and realistic reproduction of instruments and vocalists. And that's what you should be seeking as a listener. The most natural and realistic reproduction of instruments and vocalists. I use those tracks and those genres because they include the most important aspects of music in natural tone, timbre, accurate soundstage width, depth, layering, and reproduce an accurate image placement with excellent details and resolution. To understand if gear has good tone and timbre, the music must use acoustical instruments. Natural and accurate levels of reproduction is what an audiophile seeks, and that isn't obtained by gear that is artificially boosted, elevated, and enhanced. To fully understand the capabilities of gear, you need reference music that is reproduced in a natural and accurate way. If gear can accurately portray a tonally correct piece of music, it can portray any musical piece accurately. Starting with a neutral and natural DAC and amp, and an honest, tonally correct track, you can determine if a headphone, IEM, or speaker is struggling in any way of sonic reproduction. In all honesty, music preference has nothing to do with testing gear. The truth of the matter is that it is the actual recording, what instruments and how they are recorded, that matters the most. Limiting your test materials to one or a few genres will limit your impressions of the gear. By expanding your test tracks list to cover a variety of genres, you will expand the opportunities to find out more capabilities or disabilities that the gear has. Also, being very familiar with the test tracks and source gear is important so that you can determine when something isn't being reproduced properly. So, does music preferences impact your sound impressions of gear? Yeah, it does. If you understand what you are seeking for your music preference and what the reviewer is listening to and how the reviewer explains it all, then you can find the gear you are seeking. But if you don't understand what the reviewer listens to for reviews and what they mean with terms and definitions, then you may be in for a very frustrating search. It is particularly important, in my humble opinion, that you get to know your reviewer as best as possible, understand their terms, their definitions, music preferences, and gear used. If you want to know more about me, The Honest Audiophile, watch the Get to Know the Honest Audiophile playlist, and you'll learn a whole lot more about me than I probably should have ever told you. But anyways, it's important. Get to know the reviewer and understand where they're coming from if you really want to find what you're seeking. It's been Dave, the Honest Audiophile. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Speaking of next video, somewhere on screen, subscription links, notification bells. If you haven't already, please check those off. Don't forget to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to the video. And also check out all the links down below. There's all kinds of information on there regarding how you contact channel, follow channel, support the channel. All that kind of stuff is listed down below. And finally, remember to enjoy the music and that honesty is the best policy.